Life is messy. We know that, we experience that, and it's because of that reality, the messiness of life, that we are in a two-part message where we are talking about what it means to untangle the mess. Because if we think about the way that God has created us, in Psalm 139, David writes words that describe us as created by God in the image of God, and he says that we are knit together in our mother's wombs. And the reality is, with that good creation that God has made, the very threads, if you will, that have been woven together that make us us, often through life's circumstances and through our own personal relationships and our own choices, the threads that make you you get tangled up with a whole bunch of other things. A whole bunch of other things that make it difficult to walk through life because you are tripping and you are tangled and you're trying to figure out how do you deal with the complexities of life as well as the reality of the way the mess actually makes you feel in the midst of it. And so our own lives gets tangled up with a bunch of other things, often things that we didn't expect. Parent-child relationships lead to wounds that we carry with us into our adulthood, leaving us to have experiences and feelings of abandonment or loss or things that we didn't know that were there until something happens that brings those out within us. Or you enter into a marriage and find yourself in an unexpected divorce, and all of a sudden, the messiness of life starts bringing some things out within you. You start to have certain patterns of behavior in the workplace, in life, that you become people-pleasing or perfectionistic or self-critical of yourself as a way to deal with the mess. Because what life has taught you in the midst of the mess is maybe life has taught you that pain is hard, and so you become self-critical, because if you can criticize yourself, you don't have to deal with the mess when somebody else criticizes you. Or if you become perfectionistic, you can protect yourself from feeling the pain of the mess. You can protect yourself from failure, because if you are perfect, how do you fail? And so you create ways that maybe you can protect or prevent yourself from experiencing the mess and the pain of life. Or when life gets overwhelming, you come up with patterns of ways that numb this or help you not deal with the way all of this feels when it's out of control. So maybe you turn to technology or substances or overeating or undereating or self-harm as a way to make sure you don't feel the way pain feels when you experience the mess. So maybe your body tries to protect you from revisiting pain of your childhood or pain of a traumatic moment in your life. That ways our body is trying to protect us from the pain. And because of the reality of that we are trying to protect ourselves from pain or prevent ourselves from pain, we often have a hard time untangling the mess because we don't want to go to those places. And so we're willing to bring certain parts of ourselves into relationship with Jesus, but we don't want to bring all the parts. We're willing to bring parts of ourselves in the relationship with Jesus, but we don't want to deal with the addictive patterns or the unhealthy coping mechanisms. We want to bring certain parts of ourselves into relationship with Jesus, but we don't want to go there to the places where the deep shame exists. The thing that happened to us, the lies that we believe about ourselves. And so last week we talked about a number of steps that come from a book by the name Boundaries for Your Soul. And in this work by Dr. Allison Cook, if you want to dig more into a number of these things, I encourage you to read her work. It's incredibly helpful. And so we talked about the first 3 steps last week in light of Psalm 139. And so step 1 was the idea of focusing. Of when we look internally, of examining ourselves, examining our own heart and our mind to find what are the things in our life that are troubling to us. What are the things in the ways that we are thinking about ourselves or thinking about life or the things that have happened to us? What are the things that maybe we have responded to, the unhealthy patterns we have created to deal with our own pain, or maybe even the ways that we're trying to protect ourselves from pain, the focus in on those, that became the beginning place, that we invite God to help us examine our heart and mind and then pay attention to what God brings to our mind as something that is within us troubling ourselves. And the challenge that we learned as we talked about those is that the protective part of ourselves often doesn't want to go to those places. It's too painful, or it's too scary, or it's too risky. And then the second step that we talked about is what I think is the most difficult, and that's befriending the parts of ourselves that we hate. Because often when you and I see the mess, we also see the parts of ourselves that have turned to sin, or the parts of ourselves that have experienced pain or loss or tragedy, and we hate the wounds that are there. We hate the choices or the brokenness that we have caused in our own world. And so we look at those things, or we look at the ways that we respond to pain, and we say, I hate that about myself. Maybe you have even experienced that you've prayed to God to take away certain parts of yourself because you hate the way you respond when you feel that way or think that way or experience that thing. Yet befriending ourselves means we learn to treat ourselves the way that Jesus does. Which it's interesting to me that we often struggle with that because most of us, if we have a good friend, we would never allow our friend often to talk to themselves the way that we talk about ourselves. We never let a person say to our friends the kind of things that we say to ourselves. And so what if we learn to befriend the parts of ourselves that we hate, to begin to have compassion on ourselves, to begin to better understand where is the pain and why is it there, and what's at the root and the heart of it. And so we reminded ourselves by the truth that there is no part that Jesus doesn't love. The reminder that even in the midst of the sinful parts, the parts that choose unhealthy patterns, that there is no part that Jesus doesn't love. Every part of you is a part that Jesus died for. Every part of you is a part that is welcome here. And so we closed last week by inviting us to draw near to Jesus, not just parts of ourselves to Jesus, but every part of ourselves. Now, there's a way that psychologists talk about the parts that I think is helpful. And now, if you don't like this is not like a way the Bible talks about the parts of ourselves, but I think this model that psychologists use to talk about the parts of ourselves can be helpful when we think about the way the scriptures talk about who we are and integrating ourselves and bringing our burdens to Jesus. And so one of the ways that psychologists talk about the parts is that you have all of ourself that is made in the image of God. And when we are living in reality of who God made us to be, when we are living led by the Spirit, we are confident and we are clear who God made us to be, and all of the parts work together to help us fulfill the mission and calling God has for us. All of the parts are integrated and working together so that we might love God and we might love others. But the reality is when this is inside of the mess, the parts begin to pull and fight against one another. The parts begin to be at battle against each other, causing there to be some alignment issues, if you will. And so each of these parts then often respond in ways that sometimes lead to unhealthy ways of thinking, or even lead to sinful patterns or choices that actually hurt us and lead us to not follow Jesus in the way we think about ourselves or in the way we simply live in the world. And so I want to describe a couple of these parts for you. The managers and firefighters are the protector parts. And so managers will be the first one I want to talk about. Managers prevent pain. That's what they do. That part of you is working to prevent pain. And so the parts of you, if you think about your own life, the part of you that worries, or the part of you that's self-critical or perfectionistic or controlling or people-pleasing, right? That is the manager part of you. And so that part of you is always working because the manager wants to make sure we're not tangling up any more knots in this. The manager goes to bed thinking through all the possibilities of what could go wrong with your kids tomorrow, because if you list out all the possibilities in your head, in your mind, that part of you is just trying to protect your kids. It's trying to prevent pain. It's trying to prevent a tragedy from happening again. The part of you that becomes self-critical, right, and starts to speak criticism to yourself is doing that because it is actually preventing you from having to feel what it feels like when somebody is critical of you, because you've already said the worst thing. The part of you that becomes perfectionistic is trying to prevent pain because if you make no mistakes, you don't have to feel what it feels like to fail. And so the reality is the managers are actually trying to do a good thing. The managers are trying to prevent pain. That's actually a good desire. It's trying to keep us safe. The problem is the managers try to prevent pain in ways that aren't healthy. They try to prevent pain in ways that aren't in alignment with the way that God teaches us to live. When God teaches us to cast all our worries on Him, when the scriptures teach us that it's okay to not be perfect, and we can receive criticism from others in order to learn and grow. Now, the firefighters are a different part of us that are also trying to protect us. The firefighters, though, aren't trying to prevent pain. The firefighters would be the parts of you that try to extinguish the pain. And so the firefighters are the parts that get activated when you experience pain or loss or trauma. And so often what happens in the midst of an experience like that is your body can't process those things. Your body doesn't know quite how to deal with all of those. And so your body goes into a mode where it's trying to figure out how to extinguish the pain. And what tends to happen is you experience pain or loss or trauma, maybe as a child, and then at some point in your life, your body remembers the way it felt when it felt that pain, and it activates the firefighter, and then the firefighter says, I know what this is going to feel like, let's make sure we don't feel that. And so the firefighters are the part of you that over or undereats, or self-harms, or is addicted, or overspends, or lashes out, or disappears in a daydream. It's the part of you that does those things because if I do those things, I don't have to feel these things. If I can find something I can control, I don't have to deal with what I can't control. Now, what's interesting about that, because we can all turn to look at those things and those addictive patterns or in those unhealthy behaviors and say, all right, that's not good. That's not what God desires. What it can be really difficult for us to see is that underneath that is a part of you that is actually trying to do something good. A part of you that is trying to protect you. A part of you that I believe can be redeemed and repurposed for good. The third part is the exiles. Now, the challenge with the exile part of you is the protector parts of you don't want you to deal with the exiles. That it's often these other parts that are fighting against you, dealing with the exiled parts of you. Exiles are the parts of you that are stuck in the past where something painful happened. And when I say something painful happened, that could be self-inflicted or that could be caused by others. Right? That could be pain that comes from the reality of life, that there's pain and loss. We live in a broken world. It could be the result of pain that's because of your own sinful choices. It could be pain that comes because of sin somebody's done to you. Right? All of those can be ways that the exiled parts come to exist in your life. And so often it's in these parts that there are wounds of shame and fear, insecurity and hurt and loneliness and sadness. And so then what happens is the managers get cued in and are on high alert and said, let's not go there because I don't want to feel pain. I don't want to fall into those patterns. I don't want to feel the hurt and the fears that I felt when I was in that place. But the ways that God wants us to untangle all of this is in an understanding that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, that all of these parts of us are parts that are good and can work together for the good of a God who loves us. And so I want to take us into the book of 1 Peter, because in the book of 1 Peter, Peter writes these words, and I believe they're incredibly helpful when we think about the way that all of these parts of us are dealing with burdens, things that are heavy, things that we carry with us. Because the reality is when we draw near to God with all of these parts, the goal isn't just to be close to Jesus, but then to do something with the things that we're carrying. And so I want us to explore what does it look like then for us to give these burdens to Jesus, and then how do we then live as our Spirit-led selves in light of those. So I'm going to begin reading in chapter 5, verse 6. We'll read through verse 11, and then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about the significance of this for us. Peter says this, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Be self-controlled and alert. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. Resist him, standing firm in the faith, because you know that your brothers throughout the world are undergoing the same kind of sufferings. And the God of all grace, who called you to his eternal glory in Christ, after you have suffered a little while, will himself restore you and make you strong, firm, and steadfast. To him be the power forever and ever. Amen." Now, this passage is written by Peter to persecuted Christians in Asia Minor. All right, so if Peter has any audience that is familiar with suffering, it is this audience. Right, they are their lives are at risk. They are watching friends and family be killed because of their faithfulness to Jesus. And so Peter wants to write some words to encourage them. He wants to write some words that says when all of life is a mess far beyond what many of us can imagine, he says, I want to give you some words that can give you hope in the midst of it. And so now our suffering is certainly different than their suffering, but the hope that they have is the same hope that we have in our own kind of suffering. A hope in the midst of all kinds of pain and heartache. And so Peter begins, and I love how he begins. He's saying, humble yourselves under God's mighty hand that he may lift you up in due time, which most of us don't like to hear that word, in due time, right? We don't want the time it takes to get up to the moment of healing and restoration and redemption. But Peter says it's coming. And you're looking for it, and you're waiting for it, and you're longing for it. He says it's coming. And then in the meantime, he says in verse 7, cast all your cares on him. In due time, while you are waiting for the results, while you're waiting for the thing that's going to give you hope, cast all your cares on him. Now, Peter describes the people that he is writing to in the book of 1 Peter as they are chosen by God, that they're actually Gentiles chosen by God, which I think is incredibly powerful, because that means many of the people who he's writing to didn't grow up reading and learning and studying all this. Like, the whole God thing is new to them. They didn't grow up memorizing the Hebrew scriptures and following the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They have come to follow Jesus as the Messiah in recent years, and so they're following Jesus now, and they're trying to figure out this thing. As they follow Jesus, their lives are at risk, and Peter is writing them saying, you are chosen by God. That I've chosen you, and I've given you a family, I've given you hope, I've given you, you are a part of my kingdom, you are a part of my covenant or my promise. And so he then speaks to them in the midst of their suffering, the hope they have, and the mission they have as followers of Jesus. And so we read Peter write these words that would give them hope, words that give them instructions of what to do with the pain, but also the things to be aware of and how to respond in it. So he says, cast all your anxiety on him, or all your cares on him, because in the midst of the pain, in the midst of the hurt, Peter says the way to respond is to give all of the complexity of this to Jesus. That there is not one aspect of your life that Jesus doesn't want to carry. And so give it to Jesus. Jesus in Matthew says, come to me, all who are weary and heavy burdened, and I will give you rest. So some of you have been trying to carry some things that God doesn't want you to carry on your own. Some things that are too heavy. And maybe you don't want to believe about yourself that there are some things that are too heavy, but maybe Jesus wants you to know it's okay that it's too heavy for you, because he wants to carry them for you. And then as Peter writes those things, he reminds us, like, there's an enemy at work. There's an enemy at work prowling around like a lion. And I think it can be easy for us to look out in the world and see the way the enemy is working. We can look and we can point the finger at the way the enemy's working. We can say there's hatred and there's division and there's broken relationships, like the enemy's doing some things. But I think equally as important is pointing the enemy in here, that when we look at the parts, the enemy's doing some things, driving the parts, making them work against each other. The enemy's doing some things in us that makes us turn to some ways, some sinful ways or broken ways or unhelpful ways of thinking about life and reality that actually drive us far away from God. And so Peter says, be aware. Like, be aware. There are some ways that you are thinking and living that aren't the way God desires. Pay attention to that. And then verse 9, he says, you know that the family of believers throughout the world is undergoing the same kind of suffering. And it's a powerful statement, not because it makes the suffering less, but everybody in the midst of suffering needs to know they're not alone. Because when Peter is writing this letter, you can picture a small group of Christians gathering in a house, listening to the words that Peter wrote, reading this letter out loud, and realizing, like, oh, a couple towns over, there's somebody who's feeling what I'm feeling. Like hundreds of miles away, there's a person who has the same fears that I have right now. So there is not any suffering you face that you face alone. And so maybe you're dealing with some wounds that come from your childhood, that you are dealing with the abandonment of a father or a mother who's left you, and you are dealing with the repercussions of that now in your adult life. You're not alone. Maybe you experienced trauma, And that the way you have responded because of the trauma and pain in your life is with a disordered relationship with food. And maybe you look at that and you don't know a lot of other people who struggle the same ways that you do with food. Maybe what you need to know is you're not alone. Maybe you've turned to substances to numb the pain because you know what the exiles are. Like, you know what it's like to go to those places, but you've had to turn to something to make sure you don't feel it because it's too overwhelming to feel it. Maybe you need to know you're not alone. The thing that you often want removed from you, the thing that's a part of you that you want nothing to be like in your life, is the part of somebody else's story too. Which can be encouraging for your own story, but it also means it can be incredibly a redemptive part of your story. Because the thing another person might need is to know that you can make it. And so they see the way that God has redeemed you and the hurt and the pain that you've walked through, and they can realize, oh, there's a hope for me, because maybe I'm 15 and struggling with these things, and I see somebody who's 45 and has a family and kids and is figuring out these things, and if they walked through it and made it through, maybe I can. See, Peter says in verse 10, God will himself restore you and make you strong. And he says it's after you suffered a little while. Like, he doesn't pretend like, oh, it's suddenly all perfect and gone and there's no more pain, there's no more hurt. He doesn't act like it's just really easy to bring all this stuff. No, after you've suffered a little while, the end result, like the end place we're getting, if we know the trajectory of the story, God will himself restore you and make you strong. God will restore you. God will make you whole. God will redeem you. God will make you strong. And so when we think about these steps and what it looks like to untangle the mess, I want to think about two important parts. One is the step of giving your burdens to Jesus. And so I want us to think about giving your burdens to Jesus, and then after that we'll touch on what it looks to then integrate all the parts of us back into ourselves and who God made us to be. See, when we ended last week, we ended with this moment to draw near to Jesus, to bring every part of us to Jesus. And the reality is that when we draw near to Jesus, it's not just about being in the presence of Jesus, but that Jesus actually wants to carry our burdens. And so when Peter says, cast all your burdens on me, on Jesus, what he's asking us to do is he's actually asking us to put something into practice. Not just to know that God cares for us, but to actually do something with the things that we are carrying. And so I want to define this and help kind of put some flesh on it for us to think about what it means to give your burdens to Jesus. A burden is something, whether that be mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, that is tiring for you to have responsibility to carry. Right? So a burden is anything that you are mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually carrying that you feel like it's your responsibility to carry with you into your life, your relationships, or just kind of your future. And that can be an extreme belief you have about yourself. It can be a physical experience that you've taken on as a result of a painful experience. Burdens can start at any time in the midst of any kind of circumstance or experience. It can happen before you can remember. It can happen early in childhood. Or it can happen at all different points. And burdens can be beliefs. They can be feelings. They can even be physical symptoms. Or there are a number of different ways that you might experience some burdens. And so to give some examples, burdens of beliefs would be maybe you believe someone's hurting me, so I must have done something wrong. And so somebody hurt me, and here's the experience. Well, I must have done something wrong to deserve this, or that caused this, or created this situation. Or maybe, or many of you probably have heard people who've gone through divorce, kids who've gone through divorce and say, "Oh, it's my fault." Right? That's a burden of belief, that in the midst of something that happened, somebody coming to a belief that's not true, but it's a belief that somebody now carries with them. Or a false belief that somebody could carry would be, one of my parents had an affair, so I'm going to have an affair too. Or I've experienced loss, and I could have done something different. It's all my fault. Or a burden of belief that the only way that I'll be loved and approved is if I take care of the other people in my life. Or maybe a belief that powerful people are bad, or men can't be trusted, or women can't be trusted. Or they're beliefs that you carry with you. They're burdens that impact now your relationship with yourself and with other people and your relationship with God. Burdens of feelings would be more in the emotion side of things, not just something that you believe, a thought in your head, but actually the way you feel. And so right, we all feel anger, but maybe you experience a disproportionate amount of anger. Maybe you even struggle to know, where did that come from? Why am I so angry all the time? Anger is often a way that our bodies feel control. And so maybe for you, it's an emotion of anger that your body turns to because of the burdens it carries. Maybe you have feelings of self-doubt or chronic shame. Maybe there's a feeling of worthlessness or a fear of commitment, right? They are not just beliefs, they're emotions, fears that get stirred up in you as you experience different things. And then burdens can be physical. You could have a persistent headache or tightness in your body, a knot in your stomach, or insomnia. Right? You can physically experience burdens in your body. Now, the physical symptoms can also be challenging because they certainly can be symptoms of other things. So you have to take that in light of the other things we know about burdens. And the thing, though, that's challenging then about these burdens, remember, if we think about the parts, the way we often respond is when it comes to these burdens, we get really, really scared of going to these places. And so the moment we start to bring it up is the firefighters are like, let's not go there. Like, let's not go there because it's too painful. The protector parts are, let's avoid going to that place and being there. Let's not go to the places of pain. And so burdens can come from all kinds of places and can be incredibly scary for us to go to those places. But I also believe going to those places is incredibly healing, incredibly powerful. And if you're somebody who's like afraid of going to those places, think of it like you think of exercise. Right? When you exercise or you lift weights, the more you do it, the more it builds the muscle. And the more the muscle builds, the easier it gets, and the more weight you can lift, and the heavier the things are that you can carry. The same thing is true when it comes to the burdens and giving those burdens to Jesus. The more you go to those places, the more you build the muscle, and the more you feel brave to go to those places and you don't feel the fear the same way. But the way you feel the first time is going to feel a lot scarier. But the more you do it, the more you give those to Jesus. This isn't just give it to Jesus and it's all gone forever. This is a daily thing of how do I give these burdens to Jesus and recognize this. And the more you do that, the easier it gets to go to those places and to find healing in those moments. Psalm 55, verse 22 says, give your burdens to the Lord and he will take care of you. Which means no matter how afraid you are of doing this, he will take care of you in it. There are lies that I've found in my own life, burdens of belief that I've had that I didn't know I had until I was in counseling in my 30s for a miscarriage, that I didn't realize that there were things I believed all of my 20s that stemmed from beginning to believe certain things growing up in a home with an alcoholic father who died when I was 6. There were things that I didn't know were there till much, much later. And the reality is we all have the burdens that we carry, places of pain and burdens of beliefs and burdens of our feelings and our emotions that weigh heavy on us. And so the way I want us to think about giving those burdens then to Jesus is two things: naming our burdens and understanding our relationship to those burdens. So we are looking at the mess. The place to begin is, what is the burden? Name the burden. It's a chronic shame. It's the way I feel about myself. Or it's this belief that I carry that I will never be good enough. That I'm not being true to myself or who God made to be. And then understand your relationship to those things. What's the ways that you respond? What are the patterns of behavior that aren't good? The ways that maybe you are struggling with hurting yourself because of something that happened, or ways of thinking that have shaped you. Understand your relationship to those burdens. Name the burden and understand how you relate to that burden. And then I want to encourage you to give that burden to Jesus. Because if you can name it, and if you can understand the way it can impact you, I also believe you can name that to Jesus in prayer and invite Jesus into every part of our life. And when you invite Jesus into the pain and the burden, I want you to hear and receive from Jesus what he offers. Because Jesus always offers to carry our burdens. And so if you try to give the burden to Jesus, if you are praying in your heart and your mind and you feel like he's like, oh, he's not, I'm out, I don't want it, that's not Jesus you're hearing. That's the enemy. The enemy is fighting against it. Because Jesus always offers to carry our burdens. He always offers to take care of us. He always speaks truth to us. And maybe there's parts of us that have a hard time believing that. Maybe even the wounds we have make it difficult to believe that. But Jesus always responds with the promise that he is there in the midst of it. And so when we are overwhelmed because of the messiness and the reality of life, Jesus is teaching us that you are stronger than you think, that when you are weak, that he is strong. When you fear that life is too hard for Jesus to be present in the midst of, Jesus will teach you that you can do all things through him who gives you strength. When you question your own identity in the midst of all of the burdens you carry, Jesus will remind you that you are his masterpiece. When you fear that you're not worthy or you're not good enough, Jesus will remind you that you are being transformed into his image and likeness. And when you fear being abandoned and left alone, Jesus will remind you he will never leave you. He will never forsake you. There is no burden too heavy for a God who can carry the cross. And so maybe you look at your own burdens and it's too heavy for you, and that makes you doubt whether or not God can or wants to carry those burdens. But if you look to the cross, he's already proved he can. And so there is nothing you face, there's no fear you face, there is no lie that you believe, there is no sin that you've done that is too heavy. And those burdens were heavy, and the price was costly, but it was not too costly. Because Jesus carried those burdens, and he also conquered them. And so Jesus, in the midst of that, carries those. He lifts that weight from your shoulders. And as he does that, he also invites you into something new. One of the words the scriptures love to use is this word redeem, that in one sense is used when it talks about the cross and how it's a commerce language of Jesus buying you out of slavery from sin. But the scriptures also use the word redeem in the repurposing of something. And so when we give our burdens to Jesus, the next step, as we think about how do we then live as people who've given those burdens to Jesus, it is the repurposing of the pain that exists in the parts of us. That when we look to the parts that maybe we wish weren't there, what if we looked at those parts and understood what Paul says in Romans when he says, we know that God works all things together for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose, which means it doesn't mean the sin that we've done or the things that we've experienced or the pain that we have or the suffering we have is good, but it does mean God can repurpose the pain that those parts experienced. And he can invite you into reintegrating those in your life. And so the way I want you to think about that is, what would it look like for God to rename the parts you wish weren't there? So that when you give those burdens to Jesus and the things you carry, what if you went back to those parts and you said, there are some parts of me that I hate, that I'm having trouble having compassion on or understanding. What would it look like if God renamed those parts? And those parts were repurposed for good. An author by the name of Helen LaKelly Hunt does this with the 7 deadly sins in a way that I think is helpful, because it paints a picture of reframing how something that is painful and not good can be repurposed and deeply connected to something good. She says the 7 deadly sins can become aspects of a healthy self. Greed and lust become passion, imbuing our journey with heart and fire. Anger transforms into righteousness that acts compassionately for our own and others' behalf. The healthy side to gluttony is self-care, something many people have to learn. Envy, once integrated, becomes an appreciation of others. And in a society where doing is valued over being, sloth turns into the ability to be still. Pride enables us to feel good about our accomplishments and grow in confidence and strength. And so what if the parts of us that we wish weren't there, or what if they were being repurposed for good? What if God wanted to give those parts that you've named, what if he wanted to give them a new name? What if the perfectionist, overworked part became the part of you that was well aware of when you needed rest and play? What if the anger part of you that fought back against people became the advisor part of you? That instead of fighting back, had an ability to detect unsafe people in order to help you make healthy boundaries? What if the self-harm part of you didn't continue to hurt yourself, but what if it became the advocate for you? because it was a part that was so deeply aware of the tenderness of your own heart and soul. And it was so aware of the pain that instead of turning to self-harm, what if it became the loudest advocate and champion for your well-being? What if the pride that sabotaged relationship became the part that was well aware of its own feelings, that instead of responding, compensating for feelings of unworth, what if it actually responded by treating people better? What if the part of you that never felt strong enough was the part of you that was the most empathetic for other people when they didn't feel like they were strong enough? That instead of trying to compensate for weakness, actually lived in strength when other people needed it. The controlling part can become the coaching part. The firefighting part can be channeled into passion with love for the mission of God. The exiled part of you can encourage another person in their pain. In the journey of untangling the mess and giving those burdens to Jesus, Jesus wants to invite you into wholeness. Invite you into living as a new creation, into being who he created you to be. And so what I want to do as we prepare to celebrate communion together is I want us to pray and ask God the question, what's the part that you want to rename? And so I'm going to pray for us, and we'll spend some time listening to the Holy Spirit as we ask that question, and then we will have a time of confession as well as we prepare to celebrate the Lord's Supper together. Jesus, we thank you that you are a God who loves us, a God who is always kind, who is always good, who is always compassionate on us. Even in the moments when we look at our own lives and we struggle to be kind towards ourselves and compassionate towards ourselves, God, we know that you love us far better than we could love ourselves. You know us better. You know the origins of the hurt and the pain. You know the fears better. And not only do you know better about what happened, you know better about what you want for us, what is good for us. And so, Jesus, we come to you with all kinds of things in the mess of our life. The mess of broken relationships, the mess of our own sinful patterns, our own behaviors and choices, the mess of our own experiences of trauma and hurt and pain and loss. And Jesus, would you help us to name those burdens that we carry? Whether they be burdens of belief or feelings or physical burdens, Jesus, would you help us to name what it is that we continue to carry with us? Do you help us to understand our relationship with those burdens, the way we respond to the hurt, to the pain, to the loss? Would you help us to know the parts of us that we've tried to keep exiled? The shame, the fear, the despair. Jesus, would you carry those burdens for us? Would you relieve us of those burdens? Jesus, as we give you those burdens, I also ask that you would help us to see the parts of us that we have struggled to love, that you would help us to see them the way you see them. Would you repurpose the parts where we experience the most pain? Would you give us a name for the part of ourself that we hate? A new name. A name that shows your love and your compassion and your mission. God, help use us for good. To use all of it for good, the bad, the ugly. Would you repurpose it and redeem it for your sake? And Jesus, we come before you with all the burdens we carry, with all the lies, also come before you confessing that we are sinful, that we fall short in the way we love you, the way we love others, the way we love ourselves, that we struggle to love the way you teach us to. And so as we prepare to celebrate in your body and your blood, we ask that you would hear us in our hearts and our minds as we confess our sin to you. The promise of Jesus is that in all of your suffering and all of your burdens, he promises to carry those burdens for you. That he makes your load light. That he lifts those and he repurposes all of you for good. And Jesus says to you about your sin that your sins are forgiven in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit.